With Eversense, the long-term sensor helps me spend less time dealing with my CGM. I only need 2 sensor changes a year.
If you're on multiple doses of insulin, you might greatly benefit from the Eversense E3 CGM system, the only continuous glucose monitoring system that lasts for up to 6 months with one sensor. Still doing frequent sensor changes? Break free today with Eversense.
For important safety information and to learn more about Eversense, please visit eversensediabetes.com/safety.
Hello, TSF family, and welcome to episode 7, season 4 of This Spiritual Fix, where today we're going to be talking to Jeff Brown about matriarchal spirituality. This is the interview that really challenged us to think a little bit differently. Enjoy. This Spiritual Fix. 2 mystical mamas hacking the self-help game.
With Anna Kristina and Kristina Wiltsey. Hey, Kristina.
How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I feel honored and privileged today that we have on with us the prolific author, spiritual man, spiritual person. Everyone's spiritual, so it's kind of interesting given the conversation that was what came to my mind. Jeff Brown. And I'm going to give you guys an intro for Jeff Brown. Jeff was born in Toronto, Canada. And after years of doing the successful thing, the what you're supposed to do thing, including law school, excelling scholastically, and about to start his own law practice, he heard a little voice inside his head telling him to stop. And after much resistance, which is something that we can all probably relate to, he honored his calling and he took off on a quest to find his sacred purpose. And part of this quest included a master's in psychology, being a bioenergetics practitioner, among many other things. And one of the things about Jeff that I've seen from reading his books and listening to everything is that at the heart of these explorations, he's got this diligent commitment to inner work, but an inner work that is different than what we're used to in a lot of different ways, and a different to kind of the mainstream spirituality that we see that is more detached. He went on to self-publish the first edition of his first book, which is called Soul Shaping: Adventures in Self-Creation, in December of 2007, which was later picked up by Random House. And he has since been prolific in his offerings, including the viral blog Apologies to the Divine Feminine, From a Warrior in Transition, the film Karmageddon, which includes interviews with Ram Dass, Bhagavan Das, among others. And he has since written Ascending with Both Feet on the Ground, Love It Forward, An Uncommon Bond, Spiritual Graffiti, and most recently, Articulations. All of this has culminated in the foundation of a new model called Grounded Spirituality. And you can find him in print as well as take his courses at the Soul Shaping Institute online. So welcome, Jeff. We're so happy to have you here on the Spiritual Fix.
Thank you. Great to be with you on the Spiritual Fix.
So I would love to start off with this question because I kind of alluded to it in your intro is, one of my favorite quotes from Articulations was you talk about enrealment versus embullshitment, right? Of this idea that and you talk about enrealment. In past podcasts, I've talked with Anna about this need to kind of figure out what is the mother's lineage of realization, right? And I was like, it's not enlightenment, it's endarkenment. And that's the one I want to do. So can you kind of expand for our listeners and really help us understand what you mean by enrealment and kind of what is the basis for this model?
Well, I think it was primarily subjective and experiential. I started with talk therapy and then body-centered psychotherapy. Alexander Lowen, the co-founder of Bioenergetics, was my therapist for a time. And I didn't really know anything about this thing called spirituality. I was really into psychology. I mean, I knew about the journey of the soul because I had spent sort of years trying to figure out what mine was. But in terms of, what I now call patriarchal spirituality or the New Cage movement, I hadn't really any awareness of that until I ended up with Bhagavan Das living in my house and shooting Karmageddon. So for me, my experience was that I found the most expansive consciousness, the most unified consciousness, the most non-dual consciousness, the most everything consciousness in the heart of the everything. I didn't find it by detaching from my pain body. I didn't find it from turning my story around like Kooky Byron Katie. I didn't find it by practicing Vipassana, which I came to call Vipassana. I really, really had the experience of this thing that I call spirituality, which I define really as reality, in the heart of my physical and emotional body, and in the way that I then intersected with everything outside of myself. So I would go into a session with Lowen beforehand and feel sort of separateness in my consciousness, go into my body, release emotional holdings, rage, tantrum, cry, whatever it is I needed to do. And at the end of it, I would walk outside and feel unified. And so I didn't need to put on fancy clothes and change my name and hang out in Tibet and do any of those things in order to find my experience of wholeness, which I came to call enrealment. I define spirituality really as reality. So the most truly spiritual person is the one who's in the greatest number of threads of reality within their consciousness at one time. And as I began to explore what we've been calling spirituality, particularly the patriarchy, very conveniently, it seemed to be a very singular threaded consciousness. They were masters of meditations. They were masters, always masters of something, because men love being masters. And yet every other part of their life was a shit show. So, the term enrealment, it was first enrealment in Soul Shaping, then the editor at North Atlantic, we switched to it's like enrealment, felt easier and better. And it's kind of kitschy, but I feel like it says, everything I want to say. And now that we see how much trouble our species is in, it seems that much more imperative that we look at reality through an enrealed lens rather than an enlightened lens, because we need to be here for all of this in order to be able to do something to change it. Yeah.
I love that.
I love that in particular. Anna, you were laughing when he was talking about
Yeah. Yeah. When could you go a little bit?
Sorry about
No.
that. I mean,
we met at a Vipassana.
Yeah, I mentioned that when we first came on before we
Yeah.
started recording.
So yeah, could you talk a little bit about why Vipassana is bypassing?
So, of course, any practice can be helpful on the path to wholeness. But when they start selling it as the royal path to the kingdom of God, which is what many so-called male masters in the spiritual world refer to meditation as, I think they're deeply misleading us. I get why men like stillness and silence, because sound and movement bring up all their unresolved stuff. And I remember for me, it was more, I went to an Insight and Opening workshop with Jack Kornfield, who was a so-called Vipassana master, and Stan Groff, who was the holotropic breathwork guy. And I had been with Lowen, so I kind of had a different lens. So we start with Jack, and Jack tells all these soft, sweet, lovely stories, and they're very lovely. But all I see when I look in his eyes is rage. And I was studying with Lowen, so I'm like, what's really going on with this guy? I mean, is he really all calm and realized and softy toffee like that, or is there a whole shitload of stuff that he hasn't moved through yet? And for me, sitting with him and watching all of these caffeinated Westerners getting out of their cars at the Governor Dummer Academy in Massachusetts and trying to find their way to some peaceful place seemed ridiculous, because we hadn't gone into the body. We hadn't discharged the cultural holdings. We hadn't discharged the other holdings. So just sort of witnessing the sensations, noticing, being with the sensations it felt like the tip of the iceberg. So then I had a really profound holotropic breathwork experience that was remarkable with Stan Groff, and went outside and sat in front of these bulrushes that seemed so separate from me when I was just engaging with Jack stuff. And all of a sudden, I felt like I was in a unified consciousness, because I had discharged my holdings, created space inside to actually be present for the moment, and cleared the emotional debris that was getting in the way. And I just started to see many people I knew that were engaging in Vipassana on a regular basis. They, on some level, seemed to have achieved some level of mastery, but many other parts of their lives were a complete and utter shit show. And that is fundamental to patriarchal spirituality. It splits our humanness from our sacredness in its effort to avoid the unresolved and difficult nature of the human experience. And for me, any practice that does that, if you do too much of it, is fundamentally a bypassing practice.
Right. Osho said that in the East, East, which is more matriarchal, right? They can jump into Vipassana, but he highly suggested that in the West, people go through catharsis first before going into Vipassana. So I agree with that, because I feel like I did a lot of cathartic work before going into Vipassana, but I could see how it could just get you kind of stuck. Do you think?
Well, I mean, if the goal, Anna, sorry, if the goal is to become naturally meditative, right? Like I assume that's the goal, that's somehow posited as the ultimate state of nirvana or something, where you ultimately become Brahman and don't have to be here anymore. Then the question is, how does one get naturally meditative? And my view is you get naturally meditative through discharging your holdings and energizing your body and clearing your debris so that you're naturally grounded, vibratory, fluid, and self-possessed. To me, that's being naturally meditative. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to say, I think, the Vipassana tradition is very, very, very rigid and very rule-based. And I would like to think that that's because to conform to the masses and to make sure the masses get on track, they have to set up a very systematic thing. But then ultimately, as you kind of get through more stuff, you become more free and less attached to that. I don't know. It's like they had to create a very strict structure to protect the system in the beginning, but hopefully people don't stay there.
To control the populace.
Right.
I don't have such a benevolent perspective on what these dudes were up to. I really believe this was about the unhealthily egoic need to be the master.
Okay.
I believe it was about the need to control the audience for all kinds of financial and other reasons, containment and control. And to me, these are just traditional patriarchal manipulation structures. The silly clothes, the name changing, all of it is just this ridiculous shtick that gets codified and passed off as enlightenment, when in fact, really, in most cases, it's just a reflection of people who haven't worked through their material. Because if you've worked through your material, you certainly might engage in meditative practice, but you won't only engage in meditative practice. It'll be one tool in your toolbox on your movement or march towards wholeness. And any system that tells you that this one particular way of engaging, we know this from religion already, is primarily, I believe, just a control structure.
It's interesting you say that, because
they got you where they want you.
Yeah.
That's why you can't judge. You can't be angry, and you can't gossip in those spiritual worlds. So when I started to do the ground of spirituality before the book came out, I've got hundreds of threatening emails, usually from Buddhists who were enraged at me for daring to critically review spirituality. They're fine with politics, religion, every other part of society, but God forbid you critically review Eckhart Tolle. Well, why is that? I mean, these spiritual teachings lead billions of people, often in dangerous directions. It is so important that we're allowed to critically review them. But these systems were set up brilliantly so that nobody could gossip, nobody could get angry, and nobody could critically review them. What a setup.
Interesting. It's interesting you say that too, because a lot of the people I work with individually, I ask them about what their practice is on a regular basis. And they're like, well, I try and meditate. And I'm always just like, most of the people I talk to are neurodivergent. Most of them have all sorts of other things going on. And I'm just like, you got to break free of that one thing. Like, it's so, so important that there are so many other different ways of doing things. Like when Anna taught me about dynamic meditation or feeling it or doing like all of those different things. There's so many different versions of what meditation is that is not necessarily sitting down and just being mindful. And
what's a spiritual practice? I mean, it depends how we define spiritual. I mean, if we define spiritual as being in a meditative stupor, then that's the appropriate spiritual practice. But if we define spiritual as being present for all aspects of the human experience, what I could call enrealment, then anything that brings you more deeply into an experience of the moment, presence as a whole being experienced, is a spiritual practice. This is a spiritual practice. Eating donuts can be a spiritual practice. I mean, what are we even talking about? We don't even talk about what we're talking about. I mean, we just throw this word spiritual around like, oh yeah, like we all know what we mean. Well, do any of us know what we fucking mean? Like, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a more sacred experience of reality? And are we saying that we can't find that in the heart of daily life? Does that even make sense? I mean,
no. Yeah.
None of it makes sense. I mean, sure, if you don't do any shadow work, if you don't excavate any of your stuff, if you don't clear any of the ancestral debris, it makes sense that the only place you can find peace is by jumping up and out of here. Transcendence, or whatever they want to call it.
Escapism.
Absolutely. That's the whole system. And I get that at certain points in time and certain cultural environments, maybe overpopulated environments, detachment becomes the only way you can psychologically and physiologically survive. But let's not call that the path of enlightenment. There's a sociological context for that. And so here we are in North America. What does it mean to be an enlightened being? What does it mean to be an enrealed being? What's the spiritual practice? What are we talking about, for God's sakes? And they don't want to talk about the question of what they're talking about because they want the system right where it is. I don't, because and not because I'm enjoying being a gadfly, but because I actually still have some small smidgen of faith in humanity. And I would like to see us develop systems that link presence and purpose. So presence isn't just pondering your navel for all eternity till you become Brahmin like a moron. Presence is getting really here for all of this and then finding your purpose in the heart of it and turning your attention to doing something to help this species. There's this movie, was it like 2012 or 2010 with Kevin Costner? I don't know if you ever saw it. It was like an end of the world movie. And there's this amazing poster image for it where you see these Buddhists, like Tibetan Buddhists, they look like at the top of these mountains, like the Himalayas, in sort of meditative repose, like they're allegedly at peace or something. But then you see the wave coming to kill them. And to me, it just puts, there's enrealment meets enlightenment meets enrealment. Like it's just so much perspective in that. It's like, yeah, you think you've got it all figured out, buddy. Well, here comes the wave, And if we can't withstand the wave and acknowledge the reality of the wave, then I just don't think we're really here. And I don't think if we're really here, we can claim to be living spiritual lives.
It's interesting you say that too, because, one of the things that I, again, talk about is a lot of people don't feel comfortable living in their fullness, right? For whatever reason, they got their shit. They're going through their shadow work and things like that. And it's like, and it's interesting because I can feel it in them that they're only trusting so much, right? They're not trusting in 98% of the situations. And then those 2% of the situations when they're with somebody who's spiritual with them, then they're like, okay, now I can trust. Now I can open up. Now I can be a whole thing. And it's just like, you got to just like push against those barriers and just start to open and trust in a different way. Like, obviously not to every situation. You need to stay safe, within a physical context. But it's been really interesting in this journey to watch that in myself too, to see how the trust is really the limitation. Like, when you're in the masculine, when you're in the patriarchal spirituality, you don't have to trust fuck all. Like, you just have to look at your own mind. Like, there's no need to be in the context of relational experience.
Yeah, it's not horizontal, it's vertical, right? It's higher than, like as though we're like birds floating up above the human experience or something. And the best bird, the strongest bird, the bird that can sit in the cushion for longest is the most realized bird. And this whole uncomfortable and confusing horizontal plane of me and you and you and you and all of this is discarded, which is wonderfully convenient. I mean, it's like
that's the juicy stuff.
Well, so yes, that in every sense of the word is the juicy stuff. I mean, that's exactly right. And well, it's like, the irony of these enlightenment models is, in a way, it's like they're saying that God or whatever Brahman or whatever they're using made a mistake by putting us in human form, because they define the most realized state as the one that's bereft of humanness, bereft of body, bereft of feelings, bereft of ego, bereft of story, and ultimately they're going to control their mind. So what the fuck are they now? I mean, they're not even human beings anymore. So for us to come back down into this chamber of trauma and work through all of this stuff to find a way to be here before we even think about here, outside here, is an enormous, extraordinary, courageous, pioneering struggle. I mean, we're crossing the bridge from survivalism, and those enlightenment systems are just survivalistic. They're just trying to cope and deal with what's uncomfortable and put it away, to an authentic way of being, which has to include the connection to and the healing of the emotional body, because there's no power of now if you're still in the power of then in your consciousness. So Deadhard Tolle can talk all he wants about how he's enlightened and he's transcended his material, but all you have to do is listen to him talk, and the man's not even in his body. I mean, let's just get real. If that's enlightenment, I don't want nothing to do with it. And so for me, I'm looking for something alive. So Alexander Lowen would come in the office, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, grounded, energized, smart, and I said, okay, that's a little closer to what I'm after. And to me, that's real spirituality. You're here for all of it. You're not just here for the parts that feel good.
Right. Right.
That's it.
Or why else? Why'd you come to Earth if you're trying to escape the diarrhea and the rage and the resentment and whatever?
Right. No, and what's interesting is, so whenever I attempted to play that other game, where you're sort of like, you're no longer sort of tapping into your localized self. You're trying to find this sort of absolute self they talk about. But in the heart of the absolute self, I could never find a path or a purpose, because essentially I was nullifying my individuated experience. Only when I came down into my story, cleared I had more glimpses of my callings in this lifetime after clearing emotional debris than I ever had sitting on the cushion trying to transcend my humanness. It's like there's nothing there for me. There's no realized state. There's no purpose within the world itself. All it is some kind of self-fulfilling meditative prophecy. And, it's very obvious that's not going to get us anywhere. I mean, if we don't see that now, we got a real problem.
I find it really interesting. Can you kind of expand? So, one of the things that we've done in this past season is to kind of understand, we've been looking kind of at Tantra, right? So obviously it comes from a thing, but this kind of understanding of the interplay of the masculine and feminine energies, or the yin and yang, or whatever you want to call it. And obviously Tantra was created as a a practice for everybody. It wasn't just for, it wasn't supposed to be, it was supposed to be dirty, and it was supposed to be all these different things. It wasn't supposed to be exclusionary to the experience of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? So to speak. Yeah, exactly. But it's been interesting because, as we've kind of explored the feminine a lot this season, I've really felt that the understanding of purpose, because I feel as if purpose is a forward moving thing. It feels more masculine in nature to me. So I'm really curious as to like the sacred purpose, like, how does the sacred purpose, which I feel is, and maybe I'm just categorizing it, how does that fit in the whole idea of more of a matriarchal experience? I mean,
amazing question. Amazing question. And I hope I have an amazing answer. So in that patriarchal system, the notion, the Tony Robbins, Americana, hyped up idea of purpose is very different from what I mean by sacred purpose. They were calling it divine purpose in the spiritual world. And I didn't like it because why? It's just another way that the brilliance of the human form suddenly becomes something channeled through and about the divine. It's just another way of dissociating us from our own inherent value. So for me, sacred purpose wasn't just my calling to be a writer or the archetypal work that I was here to do, like from, say, a warrior consciousness to a more surrendered consciousness. It also included the relational field. So wherever there's growth, there's purpose for me. So in the relational field with my particular soul pod of people that come along that are significant figures in my life, people of resonance or people of soul-nificance, that's fundamental to sacred purpose too, which is very traditionally feminine, right? It's relationally oriented growth, and that's intrinsic to it. And all of this clearing of the emotional debris, all the shadow work the two of you are doing, for me, is fundamental to sacred purpose. Most people at this stage of human development, their sacred purpose is to get to work healing the trauma that they're carrying forward from their lives and from their ancestry. So sacred purpose is very broadly defined for me, and includes wherever you inherently know you need to be in order to grow yourself one step closer to wholeness. So I think it's probably an integration of the gender constructs. Yeah.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. I have a question. We have our own bag of tricks to do ours. What is your, I guess, top 2 or 3 favorite methods for removing emotional debris?
Well, I'm very comfortable with anger. And so I have a foam cube from bioenergetics with a baseball bat that when I'm particularly enraged, I sometimes take pictures of people I'm not happy about and I shred them like shred them like little monkeys with my baseball bat. And so that's was a very fundamental part for many years of my path. I think just any form of emotional release for me is I would say my primary spiritual practice. It's clarifying, it creates space inside for me to identify the next step on my path and to now have the energy to walk the path. You know, when you're all bunked up, you don't have the energy for anything. And what was the third one? My third spiritual practice is going to the racetrack and betting on horses. I've done so much work at the racetrack, with respect to self concepts. I mean, for me, all the self concept work is spiritual practice. I don't even understand when they talk about spiritual practice as something separate from a selfhood, like it's some ridiculously floaty, silly thing. I don't even understand. I did so much work at the racetrack because I would buy a daily racing forum, which is the newspaper for the track before I'd go the day before. And I would study and figure out who are the horses I want to bet on. Okay. Doesn't sound spiritual, does it? But it was. And then I would go to the track the next day and find that my confidence, my intuition, as Christina was discussing, with respect to who I was betting, it would get knocked off by the favoritism of who the people were betting for. So I did just so much work at reconfiguring and solidifying my trust in my own sense of self and intuition at the racetrack. And still, again, when I feel like I lose my way, I go back to the racetrack for that reason. And to me, that's a spiritual practice. It's all a spiritual practice.
I love it. Yeah.
Like what are we talking about? These dudes have told us some crazy story. I mean, I got to wear an outfit. I got to have a name change. I got to have a special holy book. I got to do a particular exact practice. I mean, the entirety of life is a spiritual practice. If you have the intention of living your life in a direction of moving towards wholeness, to me, it's absolutely a spiritual practice.
It's really interesting you say about how the favoritism of what's moving in like at the racetrack, right? Like that you want to keep
what people think, right?
Right. But I'm curious, did you ever explore I'm sure you did, but like, did you ever explore if like that in and of itself was a spiritual flow that you could kind of tap into, right? That like what the kind of group thinks and what the community thinks about something.
No, this is so interesting. So this was exactly it. I had this uncanny ability, especially with, I don't know if you've ever been to a racetrack, but stakes races, like high level, like the Derby, like the bigger races. I had this uncanny ability to intuitively sense what horse was going to win. I wasn't right every time, but I was good. And then I would go to the track and somebody else would be the favorite and people would be talking and there's, everybody's talking about what horse to bet if you go with a group of people. And that's when I would sometimes lose my way. And often, not always, but often, the horse that I intuitively sensed and could imagine being in the winner's circle would then win the race. And I hadn't bet on the horse. So no, groupthink didn't get me too far. There was some other thing I was tapping into through my body and through knowing a bit about the racetrack. I mean, it wasn't, I'd been a student of the racing forum for a long time, but yeah, it's an interesting practice.
It is. Do you think that you are manifesting, to use that word, which is definitely a new age term, as you would say, a new cage term?
Well, I think I'm a pretty good little hue manifester, I would say. Yeah, I think that I am, but it never happened to me just because I thought it first. It never happened to me just because I begged the universe. It never happened to me because I prayed. It always happened to me because I worked for it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Cool. So a question that I have, you mentioned anxiety and depression. I think that a lot of our listeners, and I know I can probably relate to this too, can kind of feel that maybe they're trying to resolve, like in their shadow work, they're kind of trying to resolve anxiety or depression, right? Or that maybe it becomes a side benefit to like kind of doing the work. Can you kind of explain how you kind of see the relation between the shadow work that you're doing and the anxiety and depression that people may experience?
Well, some anxiety is justified in the particular, right now, Ukrainians should be anxious in the situation that they're in. But for me, depression's interesting. For me, depression was, I called it frozen feeling in my first book, Soul Shaping. And I know there's biological components, and so people, point that out to me. But I just generally found it was, and in my work with bioenergetics, this seemed to be true, that It's about feeling that needs to thaw out, that's become armor, or that's just become sort of congealed, and there's no longer fluidity, feeling juiciness, right? And movement, as Anna said. And so for me, the somatic psychotherapy work, in whatever form, whether it's somatic experiencing, bioenergetics, core energetics, there's many and many more developing now, was key to all of that because, of course, through the talk therapy model, I couldn't thaw out my feeling. I could only make some sense of it. So I think for me, depression is frozen feeling, and you have to go down into the trauma tunnels in order to excavate the material, release the material, find your voice again, regain the boundaries that were denied you because of horrible circumstances. And then once you become fluid and vital and alive, you're more available to all kinds of experiences that can shift your emotional state. I used to watch Alexander Lowen was brilliant around depression because he said it's so complicated. There's not enough energy for us to get the person going to release the material. But if we can just find a technique to energize them to move enough of the material, after an integration phase, they start to feel less depressed. And so it's difficult to work with, but I think that you have to go into the body to actually be able to transform it. You have to.
I've definitely found something similar in that. Like if someone's just at that low place, I call it borrowing someone's sourdough starter, right? Like if you don't have any sourdough, if you have no yeast, and if there's nothing growing in your body in terms of like joy or movement of that energy,
Yep.
you have to sometimes borrow somebody else's sourdough starter and nurture it, right? Because otherwise it's just like everything's just like not working out there. So yeah, I like that.
So for you two, your focus has been on the mother wound. So what does that mean? What do you mean by that in relation to this question of spirituality? I guess that's my question. Just the way in which spirituality was co-opted by the patriarchy and denied the feminine, or
more like if we see, more like if we see mother as Maya and chaos and death and destruction and all the juiciness of life, and
Kalima.
Yeah, and how we resist her, and how in that very resistance of her, we cut ourselves off from deeper parts of ourselves.
Yeah.
Because we want to, in the patriarchal world of like the father god worship kind of stuff, it's very about honor and obedience and justice
and mastery
and the mother, the cosmic mother, is about chaos and surrender and loving and finding pleasure in all things, even the horrible things, as bad as that may be. And so for us, it's been a lot about the personal mother, how our own relationship with our caregivers influences this, but also how our relationship with life has so much to do with how much we let the divine mother into our world, which is to let in chaos, to let in the unexpected that she can be.
Well, I feel like what you're sort of also saying is just to let in feeling.
And that too.
In all the forms that feeling comes.
Right. And
rather than trying to control feeling and contain feeling and discipline feeling and all of that.
Just taking life how it comes every moment to moment, how it changes versus putting everything in a box. That's kind of been our mother journey.
Yeah. It's a really beautiful way of experiencing the world when you can do it, but it's been so fascinating to figure out too, like, we do these episodes and like massive learning usually comes either before or as we're leading up and we're preparing for them. And like, it's been so fascinating for me to even just see how much that has evolved from, listening to your books. And also I feel like the mother has this amazing way of setting up all of the worlds in such a way that it's like, now see this, now pay attention to this, now this one.
I'm going to fuck you like this.
Yeah. I call her the miracle bitch because she's just like full of so many amazing miracles to help you get to understand something, to expand your awareness of it, to help you process it, and then to maybe give you insights. But the most important thing being increasing your awareness and processing all that stuff, like as you call them, holdings, right, out of your body.
Yeah.
And when you give her the recognition and the power, then she takes you on a fucking ride, right? Like she's gonna take you on a ride, like, And
I think the more we've learned, and it doesn't happen all the time, but like the more we've go with it, the more we realize how little in control we actually are, that we, those big, those gurus say we are not the doers of action, but like, you really feel like I'm really not doing anything. It's all her through me, I feel like that people, you may or may not experience it depending, if you listen to this podcast, you may or may not experience that, but to me, it's an awesome feeling when I'm just like, it's all her moving through me. And
it's all you moving through her.
Yeah.
So let's back to the honoring of the self, the story of Anna Stromquist,
Yeah, I didn't think about that because I'm an asshole, but yeah.
She's funny. The reason I say that is because I used to, when I started looking at this thing that people were calling spirituality, I wrote An Uncommon Bond. I don't know if you've read that, but it's really primarily about synchronicity in the heart and all that. And now I just kind of like, I don't really feel like so let's say I write a piece or a quote that's kind of good and people go, man, Jeff Brown, you are in the zone. You are really channeling. And I get offended. I go, whoa, wait a minute. I'm not channeling. I worked like a dog to figure that thing out. Don't attribute that to something outside of me moving through me. Why is another way we trivialize the human experience? Everything brilliant, everything magnificent, everything wondrous has to be coming from outside of us. God forbid it should come from inside of us. What a thing.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, ultimately, right? I guess the deeper I go, that it's all the same, right? But yeah, I guess I've been patriarchally brainwashed to hate mankind or whatever. Yeah.
Well, we've all been conditioned to believe that the greatest thing about us is something higher than, it's out of this world. Wow, man, instead of, well, why was that brilliant insight or that brilliant relational experience? Why does any of this have to be? I don't get it. It's like we're working hard to evolve ourselves, to make ourselves whole, to become more present and purposeful. And the moment we land on something amazingly brilliant that comes out of us, it has to be attributed to something out of this world. And
yeah, that's true.
And I think this is exactly how we've been diminished, contained, shamed, shunned, guilted out, and controlled to serve a very small percentage of people in control.
Yeah, but it's interesting though too, because to kind of like, my thought when you say that is that, opinions are so king or queen, whatever they're probably king, right? In the sense that it's just like everyone's like, I got my opinion and this is how I feel and this is the way that it is, right? And so by attributing it to something outside of us, we somehow can put authority on it, right? It feels like it's authority and it's not just your opinion of what's
as though somehow our authority isn't good enough.
Right. So like Anna and I even do it relationally in our podcast. Like the two of us have had like our relationship with each other has been forefront in some of our shadow work on the podcast, right? Is like,
Great.
How are we working through these different bits and pieces and how are we like recognizing each other's triggers and helping each other get through it, right? Like get through our independent things and then get through our stuff together. And sometimes we just throw Archangel Michael in. And when someone's like, I feel like it's like our little thing. Like when someone's like, hey, Archangel Michael said this, I'm like, sweet, that's what he said. Let's go with that. Like it just kind of somehow.
Yeah, it's nice. It's a little relief. It's nice to have a little relief now and then.
And then it's just not two people against each other. So yeah, I get what you're saying. I definitely can agree with the fact that like, I work my ass off for the vast majority of all of the insights that I have. And I know that Anna does too. We go through
you're working for it.
Yeah, we go through the mire to get to that place, right?
Yeah, so it's yours.
Okay.
And how beautiful is that?
Yeah.
I mean that's
it's all like Dumbo's feather. I love the analogy of Dumbo. Did you remember Dumbo, the movie where he could always fly, but he thought it was the magic feather, and then he loses the feather, and they're like, no, you could always fly.
Oh,
so maybe
that's the same thing.
Yeah, so maybe all this spirituality is just the feather.
I think most of what we've been calling spirituality is just the feather. It's the tip of the iceberg. And it's very distracting and very bypass oriented. I think the wisdom of the feminine has to be brought into our notion of spirituality, because excluding that means excluding the entire tenor of the feeling experience, which to me is the nature of life. Thoughts are helpful and useful, but really, for me, it's all about how do I feel? And means a whole lot more to me than anything else. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And I think there is space in that also for ritual, right? That's
sure,
kind of
sure.
that's where I came from in a lot of ways, is I came from my first experience with a lot of it beyond Vipassana. So the more kind of matriarchal experience was with the crone group, right? And I was 30 years younger than everybody in the group, but they kept inviting me back and, like, taking me under their wing to show me the ritual. And the ritual always involved emotion. It always involved
Hmm.
feeling. There was a lot of sacredness to it. There was a lot of, we're moving this way and we're going to do this first, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, right? But ultimately it always had catharsis, or it always had some sort of release, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful sacredness to it, right? That it could still be, it felt spiritual in its sacredness in the actual doing of the ritual.
Nice. I think the way I think about ritual is that I'm not interested in sort of some religious or spiritual sect sort of feeding me my rituals. I would like my rituals to emanate from my individuated life experience, something that has meaning for me in particular, that's organized around and emanates from what I've lived in this lifetime. So it's not generic ritual. It's not the ritual that everybody is doing in a church on Sunday. It's the ritual that is Christina. It's the ritual that is Anna. It's Jeff's ritual. It's a reflection of your polyphrenic soul, your multi-aspected soul, and all of the encoded wisdom and directionality that lives within this organism, and that keeps that organism going more and more in the direction of wholeness and integration. And yeah,
Yeah, good.
what's wrong with that? It's, why can't it all be unique to us? I
Yeah,
mean, how empowering is that, to make it all unique to us?
yeah, yeah. And I mean, I can't tell you how many people tell me how scared they are of that, because they think they're not doing it right, or they think they're in danger,
Yeah,
or they
right,
think
right.
that
It's
something's,
another perfect control system, right? You just got to keep doing it till you do it right, until the master tells you do it right, and all the rest of that. If you let that all go and just find your own rituals that emanate from your own life story, you don't have to worry about anybody marking you.
yeah,
I mean, you're walking in your own 2 feet, which I think is desperately necessary at this stage.
yeah, yeah. I would agree.
I mean, thousands of years. I mean, how many people have you met that are truly self-possessed, truly individuated, truly integrated with respect to their humanness and their sacredness, truly walking their callings and their offerings on a very deep and conscious level? How many people? 2, 10, 12? I mean, wow.
Yeah. When you did Carmageddon, and when you spoke with Ram Dass and Bhagavan Das, obviously he lived with you, as you mentioned before. Would you say that those masters were embodied?
No, no, I wouldn't say that they were masters. I spent part of 2 days in Maui with Ram Dass alone, telling him he's a spiritual bypasser, and at the end of it, he admitted it. So no, I think they were working a shtick. I think that they were North American guys with father issues who really wanted to believe that there was this Indian master that had selected them specially to bring this brilliant message to the world. And there's always wisdom in everything. I mean, that's why it's tricky. So, Bhagavan Das said a lot of really wise things, but yet had absolutely no integrity in every other part of his life. He was known for that. And that's why the movie went in the direction that it did, for me, believing in him to me not believing in him. And, I think that most of the people around Ram Dass are emotionally very shattered individuals. And I don't believe those particular teachings are really a path back into the body. I mean, he really believed his name was Ram Dass, but his name was actually Richard Alpert. So these are bypass practices that were framed as the great grandpa wisdom, and people believed it or didn't. And I loved things about Richard, but at the end of the day, I didn't feel like he was really a very healed or integrated person. He mocked me for believing that psychotherapy could be part of a spiritual life, and I've written about that and wrote about it in Grounded Spirituality. And I just don't think that, I don't actually believe Ram Dass was a spiritual person according to the way that I define spirituality, which as reality, because I think that he was sort of specialized in particular realms and perspectives through the Hindu lens, but had omitted all kinds of other unresolved aspects of his psyche. Yeah.
Who have you met is the most integrated whole person, or examples?
I felt that Alexander Lowen was the bioenergetic guy, was closer to something I would call spiritual, but I don't know about anything about enlightenment or any of those things. I have a friend, Philip Shepard, who you might want to talk to, who wrote Radical Wholeness, whose work is brilliant. And I think he's really working to integrate all aspects of the human experience in his teachings. I love Andrew Harvey's work, but most of the people in my field are mostly imitative and just looking for the next book deal. And so not really called to something. And Philip is called to something. I know that I felt called to it. Andrew's called to things. And I think that's important. And Andrew Harvey was one of the people who was first deconstructing all of these patriarchal spiritualities. And he's often said it may help that he's a gay man, so he has a more integrated perspective on spirituality through a different lens. But yeah, I mean, what would it feel like for us to accept the possibility that nobody's even gotten close to what I'm talking about yet, and that we've just been fucking around and wasting time for thousands of years, and that you know, that we need a whole new bevy of models available to us to even begin to understand what it means to be fully here, emblazoned on our path, where presence meets purpose. We're vital, we're alive, we're rooted, we're grounded, we're self-loving, but not narcissistic. We're, you know, we're that perfect sacred balance between all these gender aspects. It's inclusive and integrated. I mean, I think it's possible. You know, Andrew calls it engoldenment in his recent book, and I think it's possible. But I think we have to stop believing anything we've been told first, and start critically reviewing everything we've been told and asking ourselves, is any of this even true? And that takes courage. You know.
Yeah.
Like, what's true about any of this? I mean, was Ram Dass enlightened? Why is that true? Every one of those guys, when I made this film, it's in the film, I would ask them, I'd go, I don't get it. You guys are saying you're enlightened, but you have no integrity. So I'm confused. How can you be enlightened and have no integrity? And these guys all had the same answer. And not Ram Dass, he had a different answer. They all said, oh, Jeff, enlightenment comes to who it comes to. I said, well, that's convenient. So you don't have to deal with all your fucked up narcissistic aspects, and you can claim to be an enlightened master. So they're talking about a notion of realization. That's not what I'm talking about, where you can be brilliant in one thing and see something clearly on a very high level, but every other part of your life is a mess. And I think enrealment means that we have to, as Ram Dass said in Carmageddon, be able to justify ourselves on every level of awareness. Yeah. Not just great in one aspect and a mess in every other aspect. And I think that's the direction Anna's talking about, where, you know, it's the direction of the mother, where we're able to be in the messiness and the juiciness and the chaos and the order and the everything of aliveness and hold it in our consciousness without having to bypass any aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious. I don't know why this is like come up. One of the things that you mentioned in one of the quote books, I can't remember which one it was, but it was, you talked about how your parts are your best friend, right?
Sure.
And so I'm assuming you're talking about IFS in that particular case. No, but what can you explain that more? What you were talking about? Because the reason I mention it is because like that whole idea, especially in IFS, but like that whole idea of there are no bad parts of us if we can and if we can look at all those different parts and we can say, hey, let's get you out of this role, let's get it so that you're on track, you know, so that you are doing something that you love. Let us be self-led beings that are fully integrated with all our different parts, and no parts has to come forward and be an asshole, right? Like you're responsible for all the internal family that exists. But yes, go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah. So when I was young, I was naming my parts. I was calling them adaptations and disguises and eventually defenses. So my warrior self, Captain America, my heady part was Encyclopedia Brown. I was naming them, and I wrote a bit about that in Soul Shaping. And I understood that these were adaptations, these were defenses, these were things that showed up to allow me to survive in very uncomfortable circumstances. But that eventually my question was, but what's my soul's journey? My soul's journey can't just be about adaptations, defenses, and disguises or parts. What is on a core level my encoded path, what James Hillman called the innate image? So my work in my life was to differentiate those protection mechanisms and patterns from who is Jeffrey Lauren Brown. Why is he here? And that's, parts work existed long before IFS, but then Richard developed one particular model for it. And I was more interested in the parts work as a soul question. What's my soul's journey, and how confused am I getting by attaching to these various parts that have served their purposes? Yeah. And then you want to get to the point where your parts are consciously utilized as opposed to automatically and unconsciously activated, right? So you choose it for an express purpose, then you come back to yourself rather than you're being by all of those outer parts.
Okay.
I had this dream like 2 nights ago, that I was in a huge auditorium with all these people in it. And I look around and I'm like, oh shit, I'm in a dream. So these are all my parts. These are all me. And I was like looking around the room and being like, these are all my fucking parts.
So Anna, name some of your parts for us.
Well, I haven't named them like you guys have. Oh, I have the dragon.
And you also have the pep girl.
Oh, I have the cheerleader.
You have the cheerleader.
Which is the go me, I'm amazing. Nice. I have the dragon who likes to destroy everything around her. I have the romance cop. Well, she's gone pretty much, but I had the romance cop who liked to say what you should and shouldn't do in a relationship.
Oh.
What you should, how you should and shouldn't express love. The romance cop.
Officer Romance.
Tina? But yes, anyways, the auditorium was freaky because I was like, there's a lot of parts.
Yeah. Yeah, my part, Anna named one of my parts Steel Magnolia, and she's the people pleaser who's like very Southern and is always making people feel comfortable. The Steel Magnolia. I have a lot of really angry parts. That like don't like to be disturbed, like the one that doesn't like to be disturbed when I'm in like a hyperfixated place, like gets really angry. And I have the part that's always so tenderhearted whenever anything that I do gets rejected. Right. Like it's like classic rejection wound part. I actually think I have an entire cluster that I've been trying to kind of get into that is all around the rejection wound in particular, as well as around the fear of intimacy, both of those. And I love what you say about into me see.
Well, that's a known thing, that strange little term forever. I mean, it's true, really, but yeah.
Can you explain that?
Well, people just say, I mean, I've heard this forever. Intimacy is into me see. That's all it means.
Oh, to see inside of me.
Yeah, would be true intimacy. Yeah.
Nice. What about you? What are some of your parts? Oh, you said Captain America, Encyclopedia Brown. Yeah.
I should spend some time now currently asking that question. Maybe I will actually. It was sort of like an old thing I wrote about and thought about and dwelled on, but now it's like I feel pretty integrated now. But of course, I have parts that show up.
Have you read Existential Kink?
No.
I've been playing with that lately, and that is really fun. That is looking at anything you resist and then trying to get off on it. Not necessarily sexually, but you look at it and you're like, oh, I've been betrayed. I hate being betrayed. I don't want to be betrayed. And then getting in touch with a part of you that wanted to be betrayed.
Well, I think of a woman who's kidnapped by ISIS and raped repeatedly by a number of men over the period of a month. I don't have the audacity to tell her that on some level she wanted that.
No, but in that case, we could say that on a cosmic conscious level, maybe we've all contributed to that because it couldn't exist without us all on some level contributing to it. Maybe.
It was a little spiritual bypassy.
A little.
Yeah, well, a lot'll actually.
A lot. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess in those kind of cases where it's a horrible, horrible thing happening.
Yeah, needless suffering, we'd call it, right?
Needless suffering. Then what? You just throw that out of the.
Well, I think we have to allow for it. If you've lived on this planet, you've noticed there's some needless suffering going on, and there may be a lesson, but there isn't always a lesson. And I don't think every victim has a responsibility to learn some wonderful lesson from a horrible experience. They may decide that there's a lesson to be learned, but I don't want to project that belief onto them. And I get that we all contributed on some level to the creation of this nut house, but I don't like to go so far there. I like to stay localized and focused on the event itself, because the whole spiritual bypass movement is telling people that their feelings and experiences are an illusion. And meanwhile, those experiences are in their bodies and wake them up at night, and they jump off bridges. So it can't be completely an illusion.
Right. Well, yeah, exactly. On one level, it's definitely not an illusion.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that too, because we talk about the kind of different levels of reality, like a parent, and then the subtle levels of reality that exist. And for me, I got caught for years in this Course in Miracles.
I call it acid, a course in dissociation. Yeah.
Except for
there's always some wisdoms.
There's definitely a lot of wisdom for me.
Sure.
What was the wisdom for me in the Course in Miracles was I got stuck because I was like, it's all an illusion. So what's the fucking point? Like, what's the point
good
of doing
question.
anything, right?
Good question.
Like,
Yeah,
what's the point?
except they're happy to collect the funds that went towards the purchase of the book. So it wasn't all an illusion. Somebody got rich.
But the point being that, like, if it's all an illusion and if we can forgive the fuck out of the world and then all of a sudden it starts to disappear, like, isn't that great? But what it came down to is that I started to recognize that behind everything was actually love. And that was my first glimpse at the mother. So without the Course in Miracles, and I still practice it because it's like one of the fastest and best ways I can really get to understand the love behind everything.
Nice.
But without that very key thing, you can get stuck and just thinking everything is an illusion. And that is so detrimental to your well-being. It's of your whole being, right?
Well, that would probably be what we call mental illness at some stage, right? The belief that nothing is real is mental illness because it's not true. It's preposterous. But at the same time, sometimes our perspective on things is illusory. And I think that's an important distinction. Doesn't have to be that everything's an illusion, but certainly we see things through a very illusory lens at times, and our work is to come back into reality.
Interesting. Very good. Anna, do you have any last questions for Jeff?
I want to know what you're up to. Are you writing a book? Are you giving sessions? You're maybe going to do a podcast? Like, what is on your horizon for our listeners?
So I'm developing my teaching model, the enrealment method, and I'm supposed to start teaching at Shift Network in June, a course that emanates from that. I will start the podcast as soon as this other thing is resolved. I do sessions off jeffbrown.co. I have a bunch of download courses: Abandonment Wound, Narcissistic Wound, Inner Child, Sacred Feminine Rising off of jeffbrown.co. I teach the writing courses coming up in April. It's very busy at soulshapinginstitute.com. And I'm going to write an enrealment-oriented book in the autumn after I get the course methodology in place. And that'll probably be the next book that I write. So.
Wonderful.
That's great.
Wonderful. Thank you. Do you
Lots of stuff going on.
Lots of stuff. Do you have any final words that you want to share with us today?
Yeah, just don't pay attention to what anybody in the spiritual world says about anything other than this, which is grant yourself permission to heal and allow that to be the door opener to this thing called the sacred life.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
so
ladies.
Much.
We hope that you've enjoyed this episode with Jeff Brown. You can find him at jeffbrown.co for more information.
And remember,
humility, gratitude, acceptance, done.
hi y'all. Listening to the last season of This Spiritual Fix may have stirred up for you some awareness of how the mother wound ties into so many of our subconscious needs and desires in our daily lives. Well, we've put together a comprehensive 5-week course on this mother wound, complete with meditations, journal prompts, and never-before-seen videos and lectures. This course is designed for you to heal your personal and cosmic attachment wounds, reparent yourself, and surrender to the Great Mother. This course is an intense experience for spiritual seekers, and maybe you're not ready for something that intense yet. So we put together our version of what we call the Shadow Work Essentials course, the Mother Wound Mini, to give you access and awareness to this wound with tools to process your energy and to remember the Cosmic Mother's love for you. I cannot emphasize enough how much this work has changed my relationship with my partner, my kids, my family, and the world. It can be life-changing for you too. Go to our shop, www.thisspiritualfix.com/shop for more details.